Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ryan Berg, and I'm the director of the Americas program here at CSIS, and I also direct our Future of Venezuela initiative. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for a conversation on the future of the Barbados Accords, holding the Maduro regime accountable. Before we formally begin, let's take care of some logistics. The event this afternoon will last 60 minutes. Following the moderated portion of our discussion with our panel, we will read questions from the audience. If you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to submit them by clicking on the Ask Live Questions button on the event webpage. Please note that a recording of this discussion will be made available on the event webpage following the conclusion of today's event. Before October 17th, the Maduro regime faced a complicated sanctions architecture of over 400 sanctions, ranging from targeted to entity to sectoral sanctions that sought to limit the regime's ability to repress political opposition and engage in unfathomable corruption schemes. This sanctions architecture sought to bring a modicum of accountability to a regime where only impunity existed. The Barbados Accords, signed by the opposition and the regime, saw a significant alteration in this sanctions architecture, as well as the course of U.S.-Venezuela relations. The Accords sought to commit the Maduro regime to certain elements of a freer and fairer election, such as to allow electoral observation missions, independent media coverage of the elections, as well as respect for the opposition's primary process. In addition to this, the Biden administration demanded two additional conditions for sanctions relief: the release of unjustly detained political prisoners, including American political prisoners, and the lifting of candidate bans that prevent opposition figures from running for office. In return for these presupposed actions, the U.S. issued general licenses 43 and 44, lifting most of its sanctions on oil, gas, minerals, and secondary bond trading in Venezuela, offering a lifeline to the regime and an economic benefit that some estimate could be worth between $6 and $10 billion. If the regime did not present a specific timeline and process for the expedited reinstatement of banned candidates by November 30th, the Biden administration argued it would snap back sanctions. The regime presented a process for lifting candidate bans that involves the Comptroller General and the Supreme Court. It remains unclear as to what the Biden administration meant by snapback sanctions, leaving much of that language up for Maduro's interpretation. And what a difference 8 weeks makes. After a number of violations of the Barbados Accords, Maduro has moved to manufacture a crisis with his neighbor Guyana via a referendum on December 3rd in which he claims a mandate to annex part of that country's territory. Opposition figures who have criticized the gambit have been targeted, and the regime has issued arrest warrants for those who have criticized the gambit, claiming that they are financed by ExxonMobil and thus cannot pursue the national interest in the Essequibo because of purported financial improprieties. How do we try to hold the Maduro regime accountable for its commitments in the Barbados Accords? Should we consider the Barbados Accords to even be operative? And what happens from here until an electoral scenario in 2024? We have an outstanding panel that we've assembled today, both in person and virtual, to discuss the evolution of U.S. sanctions and U.S. strategy toward Venezuela and the recent escalation over the Essequibo region. First on the panel, we have Jose Cardenas, who's a consultant with the Cormac Group. Jose served in senior positions at the U.S. State Department, the National Security Council, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, where he served as acting assistant administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean. Next to me to my left is Carrie Filippetti. She's the executive director of the Vandenberg Coalition. Prior to this role, Carrie served as deputy assistant secretary for Cuba and Venezuela in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the Department of State, as well as deputy special representative for Venezuela. Prior to that, she was senior policy advisor for the U.S. mission to the United Nations on issues related to counterterrorism, the Middle East, and the Western Hemisphere. And third, and joining us by video, we have Kajal Villas, who's the South America correspondent with the Wall Street Journal. Kajal has been writing on Venezuela since 2010, and he covered the country's journey from Hugo Chavez to the economic and humanitarian crisis under Maduro. Kajal writes on a wide range of topics, from politics to economics to migration, and as part of his regional role, he's worked in countries around the region, from Guyana to Panama to Argentina. So we have a limited amount of time today, and I've asked participants to hold off on opening remarks, and we'll dive right in to our set of very interesting questions and complicated issues to deal with. Carrie, I might start with you to just paint us a picture since you were in the last administration, you were part of building up that sanctions architecture, which was then bequeathed to the Biden administration, which they are now using to engage in targeted sanctions relief in order to get the regime to a certain set of commitments for freer and fairer elections. How has that trajectory of U.S. sanctions against Venezuela evolved over the past couple of years? And what does it look like today in terms of what the regime faces?
Sure. Well, Ryan, thank you so much, and thank you to CSIS for this event. So I guess to start, just to contextualize the sanctions policy in Venezuela, because people often speak about sanctions as sort of an independent strategy unto itself, and that was never the idea behind them. Sanctions were part of a multi-pronged strategy in the Trump administration in order to get a political agreement to lead to a democratic transition. And so maximum pressure through sanctions was part of that, but was also connected to things like internal pressure, providing support for the interim government, support for the people, access to humanitarian aid, and multilateral agreements and things of that nature. So ultimately, one thing that has been consistent from the Trump administration to the Biden administration has been understanding sanctions as part of a tool to use to get to a democratic transition. One key difference, however, is that in the Trump administration, we primarily used sanctions as a means to get leverage to force a change in regime behavior. And what we've seen the Biden administration do is sort of the reverse of that. They have relieved sanctions in the hopes that that could induce good behavior on the part of the regime. So just in terms of the sanctions architecture that was inherited, it wasn't just the Trump administration sanctions. There were sort of what I consider 4 eras of sanctions policies as it related to Venezuela. The first ones around 2005 or so related to drug trafficking, largely specially designated nationals under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act. Subsequent to that, the second sanctions were primarily terrorism related. As we made the determination in 2006 that Venezuela was not fully cooperating with counterterrorism efforts. The third was anti-democracy sanctions, which were implemented primarily by the Obama administration. And the fourth were the sectoral sanctions that were implemented by the Trump administration. And so these have grown and been expanded over many years, almost 2 decades. And in addition to inheriting this sanctions strategy, they also inherited from the Trump administration a really complicated architecture of general licenses, comfort letters, notices of support and authorization to conduct certain types of business, including humanitarian aid transfers. So it wasn't just inheriting designations on every entity in Venezuela. It was really a well thought out process for how can we make sure that we're having the maximum effect on pressuring the regime with the minimum effect on influencing and harming the civilian population inside Venezuela.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Jose, I want to go to you and ask you to contextualize a little bit for us the Barbados Accords. What did the regime actually pledge to uphold? And I think we've seen the administration have a fairly high tolerance for violations of some of the things that the regime has committed itself to according to those accords. So my second question for you is, what is the breaking point? What is the limit of that threshold for the violations?
Sure. Well, first of all, as Carrie said, thank you, Ryan, for the invitation to be here. And thanks to CSIS for hosting this incredibly important and timely discussion because, Ryan, it gets to the heart of your question, is Barbados teetering? In other words, what is the fate of the agreement in light of the actions of Maduro since they were concluded? And it's great to see Kajal here does some fantastic reporting from the region and invaluable resource for people like us who are trying to make sense of what's going on. The Barbados Agreement was the culmination of months of the Biden administration basically sidelining the opposition in Venezuela to begin their own direct talks with the Maduro regime. I think there was a sense of abject frustration with the status quo on the part of the administration, and that was the impetus to really bring in the Maduro regime into an agreement. Now, here's the problem. One of the fundamental flaws of this approach, before we even get into the details, is that in sanctions policy, and as Carrie was just saying, the objective is really you want your adversary to come to you. You don't go to them. And I think that what happened with the Biden administration is they over-signaled to Maduro that they want to deal more desperately than he did. And I think that sort of set this process already on a low glide path. And what's happened, now in Barbados, the regime ostensibly, hemmed and hawed on a lot. They played hardball, as we can expect these kinds of regimes to do. The Biden administration pushed hard for concrete agreements on eligibility of candidates,
sure,
on detained Americans, Venezuelan political prisoners. And what we got was tepid assurances from the Maduro regime that we would come through on that in response to more of the sanctions relief that accompanied Barbados. Carrie was talking about the oil, gold, secondary bond market, things of that nature. Now, what's transpired since then is that no one basically can state with a straight face that the Maduro regime is honestly comporting with the assurances that they made. As you noted, Ryan, they offered this very ambiguous offer that the leading opposition candidate, Maria Corina Machado, can reapply to the regime-controlled court to get her eligibility restored. I mean, my goodness, what a low bar. And it puts her in a terrible position where she has to acknowledge the legitimacy of an illegal, arbitrary regime move to disqualify her in the first place. We have seen the orders for the arrest of opposition. We have seen a few political prisoners. We're extremely happy that they're reunited with their families, but we have seen no movement whatsoever on detained Americans. And that is a fundamental point or objective in the Biden administration's approach. And Maduro has just given them the open hand on that. So they're boxed in. And we could talk about this and get into a little bit deeper, Ryan, but the administration can't go forward with more sanctions relief, of course, but neither are they in a position to tear up Barbados because, number one, the political cost, it would be a humiliating climb down.
Sure.
And secondly, because they have signaled to hostages' families, detained Americans' families, that they're on top of their cases. And they cannot just say, as part of the Barbados agreement, we're going to tear it up and oops, sorry families, but your loved ones are not going to come home anytime soon. We're just going to give up. So they're stuck in a position. I think that they have some options that they are pretty much forced to have to adopt, and we can talk a little bit about that in our discussion.
Great, thanks, Jose. And there was an article yesterday in the Washington Post about families and their expectations that they would get their loved ones home for the holidays. Kajal, I want to go to you because one of the supporting arguments here for the sanctions relief was that easing sanctions on the regime would provide them with a pretty big economic incentive that would induce behavior change. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the best estimates from folks who really look at this somewhere between 6 billion and 10 billion over the course of 6 months, which was the original period of time for the sanctions relief. So I've got a two-part question for you, Kajal. Should civilians in Venezuela expect their living conditions to improve now that sanctions have been lifted? And is there is there optimism on the ground from Venezuelans that the economic picture is going to get better now that the regime has received sanctions relief?
I would say no to both, because on the ground, I spent it was recently there in Caracas, and Caracas is very much a bubble within Venezuela. It's there's a veneer of normalcy, if you will, but it's still a rat race. I mean, people are making very paltry paltry salaries. Prices are exorbitant. Just comparing from Colombia to Venezuela, basic goods are triple the price from a place like Colombia, and salaries obviously are not are keeping up with that. And so I think there's very little optimism in that people. I see very little optimism among the citizenry that their fortunes are going to change very soon. And I think even though we've seen some of these sanctions relief measures, I mean, it's still not stimulating like tangible investment on the ground, or there's no credit. It's not really a functional economy in any serious way, and so I don't see people with that sense of hope that things are going to improve. I've actually met many people who came back from many migrants have gone back from places like Ecuador and Peru and places where they had trouble adjusting. But I've met people who actually are just planning to leave again. I mean, it's not there's no certainty and no stability, and so there's a kind of I would say society-wide sense of resignation that this is our situation. Yes, there are candidates like Maria Corina Machado and other politicians who are trying to get some hopes up or keeping people somewhat inspired that a change in their situation is possible. But in the day-to-day, it's very hard to see. And I think, and that's the perspective from Caracas, which is like the best case scenario in Venezuela, because the rest of the country is in much, much worse situation.
Kajal, I have a quick follow-up for
Sure.
you, particularly on the bit about investment not flowing in after the sanctions relief. Is that because of other factors? Venezuela is just too difficult a place to do business these days. Is it because of the 6-month window of the initial sanctions relief, or is it because the regime is not comporting itself such that it's convinced investors that sanctions relief is going to last any longer than this 6-month window?
I would say probably all of the above. I'll give you just one anecdote. While I was there, over in recent years, with the de facto dollarization in the country, a lot of people are paying with the U.S. Bank-to-bank transfer system, Zelle. It's become kind of ubiquitous in Venezuela. And just while I was there, I noticed that Chase stopped, kind of banned the use of the app. Chase Bank and JP Morgan Chase in the States wasn't functional in Venezuela. And so, I mean, that's a very recent decision they made. And so, it's a very hard place to do business. And one can understand because there's a lot of concerns about money laundering and where a lot of the funds that are circulating in Venezuela have come from, and so you can totally understand financial institutions taking their precautions. I'll give one other anecdote, actually, just from the recent days. One kind of trend we've seen in recent years, as kind of the situation is somewhat plateaued or kind of stabilized in its low position, economically speaking. We've seen a lot of Latin pop stars and whatnot hold concerts in Venezuela. And just a few days ago, there was a concert which went very badly. It started very late by this very famous bachata singer. And the Attorney General comes out a few days later accusing the organizer of being a narco and having organized the concert out of a prison apparently. And so these are the kinds of factors that, as crazy as it sounds, you have to deal with if you're actually wanting to do business or investment, or wanting to put money into the country. And so it remains an extremely precarious situation.
Thanks very much, Kajal. So coming back to you, Carrie, I want to talk about what the administration has promised and what was their mechanism of accountability, which is they messaged, if the regime doesn't comport itself or uphold its commitments in the Barbados Accords, we're going to do snapback. The first deadline for snapback was November 30th. That was a self-imposed deadline from the administration. We didn't see any announcements on sanctions snapback. We haven't seen any announcements since November 30th. And in theory, there's another window at the end of April when the initial 6-month period of sanctions relief is up. If and when we see any kind of announcements of snapback, what do you expect to see on sanctions snapback? What kinds of sanctions do you expect to see snapback? Do we go back to the status quo ante on October 16th before Barbados? Or do you expect to see something much different?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on if the Biden administration is going to follow a good policy or a bad policy. I mean, and what I mean by that is that the Biden administration has been very reluctant to consider sanctions or to consider any kind of effort that would seem to box in the regime. Now, the problem is, as was mentioned, when you go into a negotiation, particularly one where you're looking for things like human rights and better electoral conditions, everyone knows the sort of number one rule of negotiations is you go in with a higher negotiating position, right? And unfortunately, while sanctions provided that, the Biden administration has compromised on that. And what we've seen since is what I would call a sort of a weakness of effort, a weakness of language, and a weakness of response. And so in terms of the weakness of effort, when you look at what the Biden administration has done over the last year, there were so many concessions that were made merely to come to the table to negotiate, right? So there was the removal of individualized sanctions that we hoped would get the Maduro regime to come to the table. They didn't. So then we had our ambassador go to Caracas and meet directly with the regime, hoping that that would get them to come to the table, and it didn't. So then we gave some general licenses to operate for Chevron, hoping that that would get the regime to come to the table and negotiate, and it didn't. There were about 5 or 6 different sort of individualized sanctions that had been relieved just to get them to come to the table to negotiate. When you look at the recent Barbados agreement, what was sent out by the State Department, they're very vague in their language. So they talk about the removal of these sanctions, and they say that will be in exchange for defining a specific timeline and process for eventually getting those people who have been disqualified from running in the general election, including Maria Corina Machado, who won 92% of the vote in the primary, giving them a chance to sort of consider being eligible to run again. It doesn't say that they need to be eligible to run. It says define a process. There's a reason for that, because the Biden administration knows that define a process could happen, but the actual removal of those designations wouldn't. The second is begin the release of those who are wrongfully detained. Begin the release. So what qualifies as begin the release? Well, the Maduro regime could say it's the release of the 5 Venezuelan political prisoners. Ignores the fact that there's 275 other Venezuelan political prisoners. It also ignores the fact that in the middle of our sanctions removal, we actually saw another American get arrested by the regime and is now being arbitrarily detained. So that's what I mean by sort of weakness of effort and weakness of response and weakness of language. There's been no improvement for Maria Corina Machado to actually run. And if anything, this agreement said that she can petition the court, which, as you mentioned, is regime controlled, but in the meantime, she's censored. Right? So we as the United States, as we're pushing for a democratic process, have essentially endorsed the regime fully censoring all of the candidates. And I think that's very problematic. So in terms of what they're going to do, that's why I say it's if they're going to choose a good policy or a bad policy. If they choose a good policy, they will recognize that they don't have to re-implement all of the sanctions, but they certainly need to establish some kind of deterrent for the regime continuing to engage in this behavior, continuing to prevent people from running, arresting people arbitrarily, threatening to invade sovereign countries, right? These are all things that have been done since the sanctions have been relieved. I actually think that now they have been boxed in and they'll have to sort of re-implement some sanctions. I think the smartest policy would be to re-implement the oil and gas sanctions, but unfortunately I think the Biden administration is much more likely to look at re-implementing maybe some targeted sanctions, maybe the gold sanctions, something like that, so that they can at least believe that they're pushing the ball forward and stopping this kind of behavior from the regime.
Sure. Ryan, if I could pick up on a couple of threads here that Carrie laid out, and this speaks to the incredible thicket that the Biden administration finds itself in terms of attempting to decide which sanctions to put back into place, because some of the drivers, two of the important drivers, we have to remember this is a very, very, obviously this is an administration, you have immigration stakeholders, you have energy stakeholders, and you have a political team that is working on the president's reelection campaign in 2024. So all of these people have a piece of Venezuela policy. And it works against, immigration issue right now works against implementing new sanctions. Because with Venezuelans showing up at the U.S. southern border in record numbers, it's very difficult for the administration to swallow that toad and say, we're putting more sanctions on that country. Energy, gas prices, anything that the administration will do on the energy sector related to Venezuela has a very good chance of spooking the market, the oil market, and speculators will freak out and prices go up. And here is the political side of the house trying to manage these incredibly complex and difficult problems for the president's reelection. So it is a situation the Biden administration finds itself in, very few options. But they need to act. Maduro has called their bluff. This was the Secretary of State that put his name on that statement after Barbados, putting deadlines on. That was a signal across the world. And so the Russians are watching, the Iranians are watching, the Chinese are watching, everybody's watching. And if they can be rolled by Maduro, what does that say about U.S. policy towards serious strategic threats?
And I would just say, if the policy remains to get freer and fairer elections, which is what the Biden administration has messaged throughout the entirety of the administration so far.
It's been a bipartisan goal.
It's been a bipartisan goal. Yeah. Then they would have to pivot. And if they don't re-implement some of these sanctions, then either that means that the policy has shifted and that's no longer the goal, right? So that's either they re-implement the sanctions or the policy has shifted, because we're clearly seeing that freer and fairer elections is not happening. There's more censorship. We still don't have Maria Corina being able to run. We still have people getting imprisoned and arbitrarily detained. So those conditions are not improving. So this strategy, as defined by the Biden administration's goals, is not working.
And just to round out something you were saying, Carrie, the censorship that you were referring to is point number 3 in the process that the regime has offered for lifting candidate bans. It basically says that candidates are not supposed to have any public pronouncements on the final decision once they've presented themselves to actually lift the ban. So the regime could then say, well, you've had your day in court. Now you can't really say much about it. Kajal, I want to go to you specifically on candidate bans. So we've talked a lot about sanctions. That's sort of part 1 of our event. I want to talk about this issue of candidate bans and what we can expect in the election coming up, right? What can we expect in terms of who is eligible to run? Tomorrow is December 15th, right? Tomorrow is the last day for candidates to present themselves before the Comptroller General, who will then rule on the admissibility of their case, and if it's admissible, will then go to the Supreme Court. And to my knowledge, nobody has yet gone forward in that process. Do you anticipate anybody will present themselves tomorrow before the deadline? And second question is, what happens if nobody does present themselves? How do you see things moving forward for the opposition? in terms of who becomes the candidate from the regime's perspective to represent them?
I think you have to also kind of start this off by saying if there's an election. I don't think that's a guarantee.
Very fair point.
And in fact, a lot of the well, we'll get to this later, but what we've seen on the saber rattling on the border dispute, plus just the lack of progress on the sanctions front. I've heard many people speculate that it's to the regime's benefit to a certain extent to even get sanctions reapplied, because that's a great excuse to not even hold elections next year. So what happens after tomorrow? That's a very good question. I think just to reiterate something that Jose was saying earlier, that Maria Corina it's hard to see how this is not a trap for her. She's damned if she does, she's damned if she doesn't. If she plays ball, trying to lift a ban that she says she doesn't even know why she's banned, it's somewhat, kind of acknowledging that the ban has some legitimacy. And then if she doesn't show up as she's signaled that she doesn't plan to, that kind of just gives the Maduro side carte blanche to say, well, you had your opportunity, and well, now you can't be a candidate. And we've already actually seen some comments to that effect from some people in Maduro's inner circle. Diosdado Cabello just a couple days ago was making comments to that effect, that Maria Corina has just a couple days to show up and present her case. And if she doesn't, then she's out. So this is, it's not looking good. If anybody, you asked if anybody would show up to appeal their case. I think I've heard of some very small candidates may present some arguments to the comptroller to get to be enabled to run for not president but other positions in elections. So you might see some movements on that front, but with the absence of Maria Corina and considering the landslide, her landslide victory in the primaries, and that she's kind of the only real opposition candidate for this election, it paints a really dire picture for what to expect next year and what kind of election to expect. Another thing also to keep in mind is there's also with this referendum that the government held in Venezuela regarding annexing 2/3 of Guyana. There's widespread speculation that the numbers were fictitious. They claim that nearly half the registered voters in the country took part in this referendum when voting stations were mostly empty nationwide for most of the day, and so it doesn't instill all that much confidence in the electoral system, which didn't have much confidence even before this all got going. So I'd be speculating completely on what happens after tomorrow, but I think it's going to be another serious challenge for this policy gamble from the Biden administration.
Thanks very much, Kajal. So I have a question for the two of you here that you probably want to weigh in on. So let's assume that the candidate bans are, as we've seen in past elections, the regime's effort to face the opposition it would prefer to face as opposed to the one that it should face. And the regime, let's just assume for the sake of argument, is effective at sidelining Maria Corina, preventing her from running in next year's election. Again, to Kajal's point, assuming there is an election, right? Does the Biden administration recognize the person who is the putative opposition figure in that case? A person who would be devoid of that 92% mandate that Maria Corina won in the October 23rd primaries? And how would that work? Do either one of you want to weigh in on that?
Sure.
Ladies first.
My instinct is, while I would fully disagree with this choice, I think that the Biden administration probably would accept the regime sort of dictating who that opposition candidate would be, because we've seen them sort of allow the regime to lead on these initiatives in the past. Now, what that would mean is that the policy of pushing for a free and fair election is completely defunct, because as you pointed out, she got 92% of the vote. The way the opposition was able to mobilize Venezuelans both inside and outside the country is a real reflection of the momentum behind both her and the opposition movement in general. But I think the Biden administration is very interested in seeing this come to any kind of a conclusion. So what they've been saying for a while now is the difference between them and the Trump administration. The Trump administration says there's a free and fair election or there isn't. There's no such thing as being 50% free and fair. It either is or it isn't. The Biden administration has taken a different approach, which I think is a justifiable approach, which suggests that it doesn't have to be 100% free and fair. You can have some sort of wavering there. Maybe it's 30% free and fair, maybe it's 70% free and fair, whatever the case may be. But I think that percentage keeps going down by the day. And so I do think if they feel like there are these sort of accoutrements of an electoral process, then they probably would try to push the opposition to accept something like that. Again, it's something that I would fully disagree with. I think it compromises on American values. I think it compromises on our relationship with the opposition. But I frankly wouldn't be surprised if that was what the Biden administration sort of ultimately decided to do, just in light of some of their decisions leading up until this point.
Sure. I mean, I struggle to understand how we would recognize anyone but MCM at this point. But Jose, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, Ryan, I would say that to pick up on what Carrie was just talking about, 2.5 million Venezuelans did not vote for Plan B in the opposition primary. They voted for MCM. There's a devious and I would say destructive plan out there it's called Plan B, and that is to muster up another candidate in her stead, in case she can't run. They say, oh, but she can nominate the person to replace her. No. She captured an emotion, she captured a lightning in a bottle as the person right now who is representing her person, representing all the aspirations of Venezuelans for a better future. It's her. It's not her designate. It's not the traditional opposition parties. It's her. Mm-hmm. The Biden administration will tell you privately it's her or nothing, but they ought to do a little bit more public diplomacy efforts to demonstrably wrap U.S. policy around her candidacy as representing the opposition to Nicolas Maduro.
Okay, Jill, I want to switch
here.
Brian,
could I add something just on that point?
Sure. Feel free to jump in, and then I've got another question for you, Kajal.
All right, awesome. Just something that Maria Corina has a comment that she's made on a number of occasions is she has questioned who is representing Venezuelans opposition or Venezuelans in general during these talks in Barbados. Mm-hmm. Now, it's possible that the representatives who are there sitting on behalf of the opposition may be the best option they have and the only option they have. I'm not discarding that possibility. But I challenge you to find an average Venezuelan who knows anything about these people. And Maria Corina has pointed this out on a number of occasions because she's not represented on that table and has not been over these past months. And so I think that's a serious issue to keep in mind going forward.
Thanks, Kajal. Another question to you, because you've covered this issue partly in the past, which is prisoner releases, which was another part of the deal. As of November 30th, the self-imposed deadline for the Biden administration, the regime had yet to release any prisoners, any American political prisoners, I should specify. So what more can be done at this point to secure their release, in your opinion? We've seen quite a large sanctions relief package, again, monetarily speaking, estimated to be as high as $10 billion over the course of a 6-month window. What more can be done at this point to secure the release of unjustly detained Americans in Venezuela?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. Obviously from the Maduro side, they want Alex Saab, their former diplomat, financier, to be released from U.S. custody, which doesn't seem like is a viable option. It's really sad, unfortunately. I mean, we have 3 Americans who are considered unlawfully detained by the State Department, and then we have at least like 5 or 6 others with very. It's hard to really even figure out what brought them to Venezuela, and they're very bizarre cases, to be honest. And some folks just maybe some naivete, or even. You still see some American like thrill seekers these days in Caracas, even now. Unfortunately, I think the risks of more Americans being nabbed up is not off the table, and I just don't see what the. I mean, consider exactly. I agree with what you're saying. I mean, there's been quite a number of concessions up until now, and there hasn't been much movement on these people, which actually seems on the surface a fairly low cost concession that Maduro could make, but has not been made. It's a heartbreaking scenario for obviously the families who had a lot of hopes raised, especially when this rapprochement effort really kind of came to fruition back in October, and so. Things have not gone as smoothly as possible. However, I mean, we are told that the talks are still ongoing. Yes, we've seen Brian Nichols and other officials in the State Department express their dissatisfaction or frustration with the lack of progress on this front. But I'm not entirely sure what would convince Maduro to release these folks. Could just be using them as bargaining chips, and so why even give them up if you're already getting so many concessions from your counterpart? So don't even see actually, I suppose, that many motivations for him per se. Unfortunately,
certainly the release of political prisoners is less existential to the survival of the regime than the freer and fairer conditions of the election. Okay, we don't get a chance to talk about the potential for interstate conflict in Latin America and the Caribbean very often. And so we have to spend the rest of the time for this event talking about what the heck is going on with Guyana, what is this manufactured crisis all about, and what role does it play in the regime's efforts to stay entrenched in power? So first to you, Carrie, and then to you, Jose.
Yeah, I think it's deeply connected to their efforts to stay in power, and I would suggest that there's sort of 5 or 6 different potential explanations for this choice by the Maduro regime to essentially to threaten the territorial sovereignty of a neighbor. So number 1 is what I would call distracting the international community. So this changes the international conversation, pivots it away from electoral conditions and more towards Maduro, please don't invade Guyana. And I think that means the regime is sort of moving expectations from the international community. It's focusing much more on the sovereignty question as opposed to the electoral question. So that's one possible explanation. The second is, of course, economic. So Guyana's GDP has grown about 25% in the last year, largely because of the production of oil that was discovered in 2015. Maduro knows that Venezuelan assets are going to take many billions of dollars to restart and many years to restart, and so there is an economic incentive for him as well. The third one is this could provide an excuse for canceling elections in 2024. He can use this as a pretext for saying that there is some sort of national security threat or there's a state of exception or something of that nature. So there's that electoral reason. The fourth is because this is now the third significant failure, electoral failure of the Maduro regime in recent memory. So of course there was Barina state where it's a Chavista stronghold, and of course in 2021 an opposition candidate won, and that was a huge failure for the Maduro regime. The primary election, which as we've been speaking about, brought millions of people to vote and showed the power of them to bring people to the table. And then of course this referendum, which as was mentioned, did not actually have a huge turnout. And so what I think we're seeing is his attempt to demonstrate power, electoral power, because he knows that this particular question is one that tends to have the support of most of the Venezuelan population, including the opposition. Not the idea of going to war, but the idea of Venezuelan control over the territory. And so I think this was his effort to show that electoral support. It obviously failed. The fifth potential explanation is that this is a way for him to test his systems, the machinery of the 2024 election. How do they pretend that there's mobilization? How do they create that artificiality in the system? How good are they at it still? And I think that's something that they were trying to do with the referendum. And then lastly, I just think that this will be used as a huge weapon against the opposition. We're already seeing them tie this to attempts to repress, attempts to put people in jail, including those associated with Maria Corina Machado. Mm-hmm. And so I think the kind of increase in repression is another aspect of this. So there's the economic, the international community, the electoral testing systems, repression and showing power, all of that is deeply tied, which is why I think it's so great that you're focusing not just on the territorial dispute, but also the broader electoral conditions, because these are all deeply connected.
Jose, anything to add based on what Carrie said? And also I'll give you one more additional wrinkle, which is, okay. Let's assume that I think we would probably broadly agree that most of what's going on here is for domestic consumption in Venezuela. Mm-hmm. But let's assume that the regime were to consider options. I'm not talking about a full-blown conflict, but I'm talking about hybrid war, gray zone. What could they possibly do to stir up machinations?
I agree 100% with Carrie's list there, and I would pick one. I'm going to add to one and then add another. With the opposition, the Essequibo is a way to wrong foot the opposition, because Essequibo is something that is salient in the heart of every Venezuelan. Sure. And he is using it to divide the opposition because, some in the opposition have taken the bait. They have obediently fallen in line on Essequibo, saluting Maduro and obediently slouching forward. Yeah, I guess we got to fight for Essequibo and all that. Maria Corina has handled it much differently. She hasn't taken the bait, let's just say she hasn't taken the bait. She's trying to modulate the position on that. And what's funny about the members of the opposition that have swallowed the bait is that no one is recognizing that Maduro is basically destroying the country's credibility on that issue for years to come. Because the entire world, outside, of course, of his fellow authoritarians, is aghast that he's threatening a neighbor like this. So the next time somebody hears border dispute 5-10 years from now, they're going to think of bullying behavior by big country next to smaller neighbor. So they ought to consider that before they obediently follow Maduro's line on Essequibo. Now, to your point, and I think that unfortunately others have taken the bait too. The idea that CARICOM and Lula in Brazil are going to pressure President Ali of Guyana to meet with Maduro. I mean, can there be anything more strategically foolish than something like that? And basically what they don't understand, our friends at CARICOM and in Brazil, they're emboldening Maduro. They're showing him that it's working.
So what's the strategy in that sense from the regime standpoint? Is it to get the Guyana government into some kind of negotiation?
Ryan, because right now, every newspaper, every wire service. Everybody knows about Essequibo. That looks on a, and that's what they're talking about. Everyone's talking about Maduro and Essequibo. Nobody's talking about Maria Corina's eligibility. No one's talking about government regime guarantees for the election in 2024. Everybody is talking about Maduro. He's loving it. He's loving it because no one's talking about the election. No one's talking about political prisoners. No one's talking about detained Americans. We are. And you're writing about it. But the rest of the world is like, wow, look at this. Are they going to invade? But here's the problem about his political circus on the border, is that it does have real-life consequences. Already it's cost the lives of 5 Guyanans who went down were killed in a helicopter crash because they were on a mission monitoring the border. And we all know also is that when you start these games of building up a presence on a border, and Guyana's got their back up, and they're going to put people on the border, and the U.S. is there with mill-to-mill exercises, all it takes is one screw-up, one mistake, one miscalculation, and a Cold War turns hot. So Maduro thinks, everyone's just kind of, people like us looking and recognizing that it's a manufactured crisis for electoral purposes. But it can have very real consequences, not because Venezuela is about to invade, because all it takes is just one mistake, one spark.
Sure. I mean, it's easy for analysts like us to say it's not a rational decision for Maduro to invade Guyana, but the dictator doesn't always do the rational thing, and I think that's the message of February of last year, Putin invading Ukraine, same thing. It's not rational. And yet you don't really know how information is circulating within a dictatorship, within an authoritarian system, as well as the fact, as you mentioned, Jose, that sometimes these things can take on a logic of their own. Kajal, I want to go to you and then note for our audience that we're going to get to some questions in the time that remain. But over to you, Kajal, just a quick question because you follow this stuff. You've done some reporting recently in Guyana. As Jose mentioned, today there is a meeting in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to talk about this, to try to deconflict and bring the situation from a point where it's very hot at the moment, to a point where there are a bit cooler heads can prevail. What do you expect to come out of that situation or that meeting in St. Vincent and the Grenadines? Anything at all? Brazil will be there, CELAC will be there, and at least President Maduro and President Ali.
Yeah, and Lula's not going to be there, which I thought was also telling. At least he's not going to be there personally, and thought that might give some more weight to the side of the debate that thinks that a lot of this is just saber rattling and not going to go anywhere. But regarding the actual meeting in St. Vincent, we're actually still waiting myself on some news to come out of that. It's not really clear yet if there's going to be like some kind of joint declaration or anything like that today. The Prime Minister of St. Vincent was hosting the meeting. Basically, in his comments, presented this as like some start of a process. I mean, he was celebrating that both sides are kind of coming together to de-escalate, and it gave the impression that this could drag on for quite a while. On the whole Essequibo referendum and just Maduro's threats in recent days. I think I completely agree with you. I mean, nobody expects country A to invade country B until it actually happens, right? But with that caveat, I think there are numerous reasons to doubt that this will go anything beyond just verbal threats. And I think there's obviously some of the comments that Maduro just made within the last week, I believe. Where he was effectively giving like oil companies 3 months to decide whether they want to work with Guyana or Venezuela. I mean, these are we're talking about some of Caracas's most important partners. Chevron is on both sides of the border. You have the Chinese state energy companies on both sides of the border. And it's very hard to see him actually take some dramatic action against these entities that have, that frankly kept him around for as long as he has been around. And so there's also kind of Brazil. I think Brazil has a really interesting role in this. When I was in Guyana earlier this year, I took a 10-hour bus ride from Georgetown into the Essequibo, and most of the ride was on a dirt road. It's always been a dirt road, but it's currently being paved and expanded by a Brazilian construction company. These are like one of the many infrastructure projects that have been kind of made possible by the Guyana's breakneck economic growth. And so I think there's a lot of commercial interest there that I think would be seriously compromised if Maduro were to escalate this to a different level. It just really makes me doubt. On top of that, this is like the fourth time I think that I've seen somebody pull out the Essequibo boogeyman out of the closet when they needed it for their domestic purposes. And we've kind of seen it on both sides of the border too, in very different ways. But Maduro's obviously he's done actually more dramatic things in the past. They've deployed naval ships to seize some of scare away Guyanese contracted oil survey ships, and in one case even detained one. And so I don't see them kind of taking it beyond where they have so far. I think it's mostly for the internal consumption. Classic wag the dog.
Thanks, Kajal. You mentioned China in your response, which has made me think that we need to ask a question about the international community. So Maduro's authoritarian patrons in this case, China, Russia in particular. China, I think, has issued a statement in classic sort of CCP speak. It's asked for calm and it's asked for a negotiated solution, but it hasn't mentioned the ICJ and the jurisdiction that the ICJ would be expected to have in this case. So I wonder if that's a pro-Venezuela position. And the second thing is, as luck would have it, Maduro is actually expected to be in Moscow at some point in December, at which point we may well see some kind of Russian statement about the Essequibo crisis. So what is the role of some of Maduro's authoritarian patrons, particularly China and Russia, in this manufactured crisis?
Well, I think that he has put them on the spot because his behavior is so brazen that, and they at the same time are so dependent on cultivating, call it the South developing world, that they are obviously they're trying to thread the needle. They want Maduro to stay in power, to continue to vex the United States, and they're getting cheap oil on the spot market, on the black market, China, in particular. So, but they don't want to identify so closely with his aggression in order to save face with the so-called developing world, South, whose solidarity, whose support they need for their own agendas. I think that Maduro has put a lot of those regimes in a tough place. They got to somewhat, evince some sort of concern for stability. Translation: big country bullying small country, like most of these other countries are, and so it's a tough one for them.
Carrie?
No, I mean, I generally agree. I think, China, obviously Russia, these are patrons of the Maduro regime, have been for a very long time. I think essentially what we've seen most of those regimes do is their foreign policy right now, especially as it relates to the Western Hemisphere, has always been predicated on how can we undermine American interests in the Western Hemisphere, right? That has been Russia's main objective for many, many years. Their only real reason of being in Venezuela was sort of to be a thorn in the side of the United States in the first place. And so I think they will try to assess, broadly speaking, how the United States is reacting to this, what the United States is doing, and I think their policy will sort of become much more formulated according to whatever would be most undermining of American interests. They are not countries that support Maduro because they support Maduro. They support Maduro because they know that that has been a core priority for both administrations, both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, you know, for us to bring democracy back to Venezuela, which of course was the birthplace of democracy in the region. And so that's been their main objective.
Okay, Jill, I'm going to go to you for the last word as we're coming to the end of our program today. There's a question from the online audience. In addition to the deaths of the airmen from Guyana, the crisis in Essequibo has prompted many to migrate away from the disputed region, many of whom have lived there their entire lives. Is there a risk that this touches off a parallel migration crisis? And if so, how should the U.S. help Georgetown prepare?
You know, I have not heard of mass kind of you know, people being pushed out of that region. I mean, bear in mind, it's a pretty empty patch of land. I think the official estimates are somewhere around 150,000 people actually live there. And it's just an area that's a little bigger than the size of the state of Georgia. And so it's, you know, mostly jungle and a lot of informal mining and lumber activities. And so I have not heard of that, that people are rushing to move out. I would also kind of take that with a grain of salt, just because, I mean, the people who live in the Essequibo, you know, they're very proud. They're culturally Guyanese, and they've been living with this border issue for decades. And so it's not entirely new for them. Now, it is this level of rhetoric from Maduro is new, and you know, some of these gestures that he's promising, like, you know, handing out Venezuelan national ID cards in this territory. So I actually think Guyanese officials have actually been dealing with another another migration issue, is the arrival of, like, there's been about between 25 and 30,000 people that have moved over from Venezuela, which is a massive sum for a country whose population doesn't even get to 800,000. And so that's been a challenge for Georgetown, and certainly something that the international community could help them with. Yes, they are the region's new energy powerhouse, but I mean, they're not exactly swimming in money quite yet. I mean, it's still early days over there, and they have a very long list of infrastructure needs and development needs. And to add a migration crisis on top of that would be a tremendous burden for them. So, but yeah, I'd be surprised if there's actually that big of a mass exodus from the Essequibo, given the you know, the events of the last week and a half. Forgive my ignorance for not knowing that one.
Great, thank you very much.
If I could just say one last word on the Essequibo. I think it's time that the United States upped its statements regarding the dispute there. I think that what we've seen today is that DOD has deployed some assets into the region. Southcom has engaged with Guyana for some military training exercises. I totally applaud that. I think those are the right moves.
Yep.
But we need to take rhetoric from, you know, typical State Department speak about returning to ICJ and all that process, and this has to be, you know, negotiated there, into something akin to, you know, you go in there and the full might of the United States will respond to any violations of Guyana's territory and just put it down. That's it. I think we need to be a little bit more forceful.
Thank you all very much for joining us. This has been a very rich discussion. I'm sure we could have gone on for at least another hour. And I think what we'll do is we'll convene another panel as the situation, which is highly dynamic and fluid, continues to evolve in Venezuela and in the Essequibo region. But for now, thank you very much for joining us. Jose Cardenas, consultant with Cormac Group, Carrie Filippetti, executive director at the Vandenberg Coalition, and Kajal Vias, reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.